This episode of the Briar Patch is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. Want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Robert Picardo, the emergency medical hologram from Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
This is the 24th century. We've grown out of our infancy. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We've eliminated hunger, want. Material needs no longer exist. The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. Enjoy.
On this episode of the Briar Patch, the topic we are going to discuss is the Ferengi culture of profit versus individualism. For many, the Ferengi represent humans as we are today, especially in American society. A perhaps exaggerated portrayal of capitalist society. They are actually based, according to TNG and to Notes of Rottenberries, more upon mercantile values of the 1800s than modern capitalism. Are the Ferengi an unrealistic or unfair portrayal of capitalist culture? They cheat customers, ignoring the potential losses from not serving customers well, also allowing for no invisible hand. Is this realistic? What about the place of women on Ferengi society? Perhaps one of the better comments upon the reality that women have had to face until recently, and in some places still face. Have markets helped to change culture with regard to women's rights? What do you think?
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting episode because we have so far been looking mostly at the Federation. So now we'll look at a whole different culture. And in a way, I feel like this is the kind of episode that we should have had straight away. I mean, a lot of people looking at Star Trek and thinking about economics in particular, more so, I suppose, than other social sciences, would say the Ferengi would be the main thing that we would talk about, right?
Yeah, you would assume that the Ferengi had to come up once and many times from then, right?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at our episode list and I thought, oh my gosh, we haven't talked about the Ferengi, and it's already episode, 8? So anyway,
yeah,
it'll be great.
Seven.
Oh,
we're at 7.
Oh, we're at number 7. Okay. Getting ahead of myself.
But no, I think it was important to do the other episodes because I think it really laid a groundwork for why this episode's important and why we feel the way we feel about these particular episodes we're going to discuss.
Yeah. I guess you have to kind of look at the Federation and understand the Federation before you can really understand why the Ferengi are so important and so different, and so, why Star Trek would even portray an exaggerated or whatever look at capitalism. You have to have the opposite, otherwise it doesn't really make sense, does it?
Correct. Yeah, we would be just opposing against nothing.
Yeah, and you couldn't really have it because, I mean, today you have something that is sort of so much like the Ferengi that without having a Federation, then just sort of an exaggerated version of ourselves wouldn't even be interesting. I mean, it would just be like us,
Right. It would just be, businessmen. I guess this was recorded also in the 80s, and this was when Wall Street was going crazy and people were buying $1 million yachts every other weekend. And so this seems still very accurate today, but more so accurate at the time they started recording Ferengi in the original TNG episodes.
Yeah. It's their love of profit and their love of stuff was something that was a cultural, it was the cultural moment for that.
Yeah, it was perfect. Credit soared through the roof on people because it was the first time people would use credit instead of cash to buy things on the scale that they were doing it. it's also when the ideas like flipping houses came about and stuff like that all started pretty much in the 80s.
Yeah. Just to drop a little policy into there for a moment, it was because I think people started to have trouble buying houses and because of some of the slowdown of the 70s. And so policymakers started to say, look, your wages don't feel like they're keeping up with prices. And now, you can't buy houses. So we're going to give you some, a way to change that. And it was a hugely popular policy. And it was this homeowner society thing. And especially with the collapse of communism, people were very much into this idea of ownership and responsibility, being able to invest in something. And so it was hugely popular that people could have an easier time buying houses. And then that created this huge debt where people were borrowing more than they could afford with low interest rates, and with help from the government, they were investing in houses that they eventually couldn't afford. So that sort of created this whole thing, which then, of course, you can't change. Nobody wants to give up something that they already have. There's a well-known economic phenomenon. Once you have something, it's more valuable than if you were to buy it today. So people never want to give up policies once they exist. So now because that sort of created this whole thing with housing bubbles and so on and so forth. So just to drop that in there.
Yeah. And at the time, I don't have any firsthand experience. I was just a child in the 80s, but at the time you could buy a house on stated income. You didn't even need to prove it like you do today.
Yeah.
It wasn't until some of these bubbles popped that the banks were like, oh, wait, before we thought it was great that we would have the house afterwards, but now we just have too many houses. And they stopped letting people do that. But you had people walking in the bank saying, well, I make $100,000 a year. No, I know I'm only on the books for 25, but.
Yeah. And, if you go back a bit further, I mean, it used to be that, it was all about proof and trust, and, you would know your lender, and they would know everything about you. And when obviously, the economy became more complex and it was impossible for everyone to know each other, and companies became global, and that all changed. But you're right. It wasn't really until this, new, home ownership boom that people started to really not care at all about proof like that. And I remember even, in the early 2000s, like I said, these policies, nobody wants to give them up. So they had, this big zero down thing. I remember I had a job and it was, well enough paying, but I went in and I was thinking, what I could afford, and I had been renting before. So I was just doing comparable, mortgage amounts. And I went in and they they pushed on me practically a kind of zero down and we'll pay all of the fees thing for a mortgage that would have me paying monthly about 3 times what I thought I could afford.
They also did the whole subprime thing where you didn't pay off any of your principal, you only paid off interest, and then all of a sudden your adjustable rate exploded, and they knew the rate was going to go up, that it couldn't stay at the number that they were getting, which is why they didn't want you to have a fixed rate at the time. And a lot of people lost their houses over that too. It was crazy.
Yeah. Okay. But this could be a whole nother episode, and it's really not actually what we're talking about. So let's try to get back on track.
It just,
I think our listeners are kind of used to this by now, but.
It just has to do with, these were the kinds of things that the Ferengi were really invented to talk about. These kind of economic principles that see you kind of almost like a bait and switch with a lot of things.
True.
And we'll see a lot of times
that's quite tied up with policy, and the Ferengi tend to do it on a more individual basis, which is interesting.
Yeah, well, their policy is just do it, and we'll worry about the consequences later. Which we see.
But it's not the Grand Nagus who pushes a lot of this stuff. It's usually just individual Ferengi, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is. But the Grand Nagus gets his cut of everyone's. So
sure.
And you'll see that it actually comes back to bite the Ferengi later on in DS9. You find that they want to go through the wormhole simply because there's more people they can con out of their wealth, because most people in this side of the wormhole know who they are and know to avoid them.
Right. And this is something I definitely want to come back to in this episode. This question of, is it, because, in general, and we'll go into more depth, as I say, in a minute, but, it's usually reputation that prevents businesses from being able to swindle. And, if they only care about profit, if that's really all they care about, then they still have to worry about getting these customers back, or they won't be able to get the profit. If they get a bad reputation, they won't be able to earn as much profit as they want. So even if they don't care about hurting the customer, like they are happy to swindle and steal, they can't do it if it's going to give them a bad reputation. So, but you do, and so some people would look at the Ferengi and say this is unrealistic for that reason. But then if you do see them essentially losing their reputation, and people do say, even Picard says, even in TNG, I know about the Ferengi, I know not to trust them. And if he tells other people and everyone tells each other, they do have this reputation. They have got this reputation. And so, I guess, do they just not learn from that? Or do they just, because they have this big galaxy and they can keep finding new aliens to swindle, is it simply that? And that's why they end up having to go to the Gamma Quadrant to try to find people that don't already know.
Right. So, well, let's make that topic one for today. Since we've already started talking about it, but.
Oh, no. For today, I was just saying, we can come back to I have more to say about this topic, later in the episode when we get into more of the economic theory. But yeah, go ahead. Respond.
So, one of the things I think is too, the Ferengi are able to get a hold of things that other people are just not able to get a hold of. So you really don't have a choice sometimes.
Good point.
So if they feel they can get enough items of something that everyone needs, or say they can get all the dilithium in the world, in the universe, it doesn't matter how horrible business owners they are, you're going to have to deal with them either way.
Right.
And they always seem to be looking for some kind of crazy deal where they buy up everything of something and then flip it for money. So even if
try to corner the market.
Right. So even if they end up charging 10,000 times what something's worth, if you can't get it elsewhere, well, that's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And they do show up that in a bunch of episodes. They show that the Ferengi are able to do this. I mean, because they care about that, and because they can deal with other Ferengi in order to find the items, or just they have their business networks. They're always talking about that. And because they put it as a top priority and they have their rules of acquisition to guide them, they're able to often find things that no other species is able to find, or no other, people of any species are able to find.
Right. Which is interesting because they also don't trust each other just as much as they don't trust anyone else.
Sure, and I'm sure they don't get a very good deal if they're dealing with other Ferengi, but again, those other Ferengi might be the only place they're able to find the wholesale version, or the bigger wholesale version.
Right, and then they end up cornering the market together, much like, say the oil companies do. The OPEC nations would. They do something along those lines. They band together so they can set the prices.
Yeah, absolutely, and they talk about that, if you can't get a monopoly on, if you're not allowed to corner the market, when Rom is going to become the new Grand Nagus and the rules are changing, Quark says, if you're not allowed to be a monopoly, what's the point?
Right.
If you can't corner the market, why would I do it?
Correct. So, all right. With that being said, does it mean that the socialist collective argument is more correct, that the Ferengi are unrealistic?
Right. So I would say that there are a few possibilities when you're looking at the Ferengi and you're saying, are they realistic? I think there's a few possibilities. You could say, A, that the arguments made by, say, Marxists and others about capitalism are actually correct. If the Marxist type arguments are correct, that would mean that capitalism is not based on an invisible hand, that profit doesn't lead to a better society. So the Ferengi perhaps are a realistic portrayal of what capitalism, if not now, at least in the long run, leads to. It leads to a type of society or a type of people who swindle everyone, who don't care about anything. You don't have a benevolent outcome. So, A, that's correct. Actually, the ideas of Adam Smith and Austrians and so forth are just wrong. And actually, the Ferengi are realistic. Or B, the Ferengi are unrealistic because they don't have, it's not human nature. So maybe it's Ferengi nature, maybe they're realistic for Ferengi, but they're unrealistic applied to us because human nature is not guiding this society. So you're not getting a benevolent outcome because it's not based on human nature. Or, for example, their actions would lead to different results because you do have human nature. So they're unrealistic because it's just, that's not how things would come out. They wouldn't act like that. You wouldn't get that kind of an outcome. So, or C, it's the conditions that are different in that lead to the result that you see with the Ferengi, because there's a lack of scarcity, because there are so many different alien worlds of customers that even though they swindle people, there's always someone new to swindle, or as you point out, they can do things that no other aliens can do. So it's realistic, but only because of those conditions which don't exist on Earth.
Fair. I think they are a somewhat realistic portrayal of runaway capitalism, capitalism where the corporations maybe are banding together to hurt the lower population, the less wealthy. We see this, we see this in some markets when companies will go in and wipe out their competitors and then move on. That's why in places like the United States, we have antitrust laws and we have anti-monopoly laws, because it wasn't good for the customer to have that happen. Then we have other laws that allow for monopolies, such as the water company, utilities in general, water, electricity, stuff like that. And they're given the right that they're the only provider in the area, but there's strict regulation as to what they can and can't charge, what they can and can't charge for, how high they can go, how low they can go, so on and so forth.
Okay, but still you have the question of whether it's realistic, if you had none of these laws, that you would actually have this almost ubiquitous ripping off, treating people terribly, swindling customers in any way that you can, that you generally get from the Ferengi. I mean, the Ferengi will make honest deals when they have to, but they don't seem to want to make honest deals at all if it's up to them. They always want to rip you off. Doesn't that seem a little bit unrealistic if you're thinking of human nature, I suppose, rather than Ferengi nature, or if you think of them as, as everyone is having the same nature except for the way that culture affects it. And that's another thing that we should talk about, because the Ferengi have been known on an individual basis to change quite a lot when living, say, among Federation people on DS9. But in any case, if you're thinking of them, as having the same nature as us, is it realistic that if you don't have these antitrust laws and so forth, that you would really have that kind of willingness to screw people over?
Yes. Plain and simply, I believe yes. I believe we have plenty of examples of it. I think we could look at when they when they took out regulations. But when they lowered the regulations in California, we saw it happen plenty. We saw Enron turn off power generations just to raise the price of its product.
Sure, but we also have many examples of the opposite. There have been many, many times when you didn't even have any type of regulation at all, and you still had, industries and companies that treated people very well. Well, it's very easy to name individual cases where companies have been bad because, they've been noticed, and it's called selection bias when you think that something is more common than it is because you're noting only the instances where it exists because they stand out, because they're known. So when you see cases where companies rip people off, like Enron, and you point to it and you say, look, it's happening all the time, but that's one company. And sure, you can name others, but again, you know them because they were in the news. You know them because, they got caught and they went to jail or whatever. But the cases in which the companies don't do that are far more common. And you have many cases where you didn't have regulations because they simply didn't exist yet because they weren't needed. Or you have cases where there was deregulation and the price dropped massively, like it did with airlines, like it did with many other things. Cases where deregulation did a lot of good and you didn't have a terrible instance of people taking advantage of people and things improved. So I'm not saying that's what always happens. And I'm not saying we should deregulate more. And in many cases, deregulation is bad but that's often because, you have other laws in place or other conditions in place where the deregulation is in a sense only partial and you're giving them an advantage or they have a monopoly or whatever, and the deregulation does a lot of harm. And obviously certain regulations, are just common sense and good, and they should be there even if there's only a few companies that would take advantage if you didn't have the regulation and harm customers. So the regulation may be a good idea and it may be doing good, but even so, it may only be 5% or 1% or whatever of companies that are actually doing harm. So again, coming back to the Ferengi, it's not 5% or 1% of the Ferengi that are doing this. It's ubiquitous.
Correct. But it's 1% of the population of the universe that's doing it.
Sure. Just the Ferengi.
Right.
But the question is, if the Ferengi represent, a country, an economy, a society, is that society realistic? Because again, the Ferengi don't have these kinds of regulations. They're encouraged to do this. If we had a society in which you don't have the regulations and maybe you're even encouraged by someone like the Grand Nagus to take advantage of others, of outsiders, do you think that would be the result? And maybe that encouragement is in a sense what makes it more realistic. And if you didn't have, and again, because that's the culture. And so maybe I think in a sense, the Ferengi, as much as they are important about economics, they're at least as important in talking about culture and the interaction of culture and economics. And in a sense, it may be the Grand Nagus, the rules of acquisition, and so forth, which obviously, as we learned, the rules of acquisition were just written by a person, just a normal Ferengi guy who wanted to make a buck or make some gold pressed latinum. But, they would influence culture, and the culture based on the policy, which is the Grand Nagus, and the culture, like the rules of acquisition, combined together, and maybe it's that makes it more realistic.
It's possible. I think due to the fact that you have this universe economy going on, that it makes this society more than plausible. We do not see anything from before they joined the rest of the universe as to how they ran their society. It may not have been anything like this, and they just realized afterwards, wow, we're really good at swindling because we've been such good businessmen for so long that if we took our talents and used them in an evil sort of way, we could make a lot more profit that way. We don't know because they could have been just as bad before. However, even though, and let's say I concede the fact that it's only 1% of companies that would ever screw. I don't actually concede that fact. Maybe now because of all the regulation and because of so many other forces, but for a very long time, companies did everything they could to hurt their workers. Let's just look at every coal mine in America up until 1889 or whatever. Maybe they were giving their product over to people at a good rate, but they were literally paying people less money than it cost to buy food in the store that they owned, and they only allowed you to buy it there. So, we had those things going on for a long time. I think in the past, recent human history would be the last 100 or so years. It's gotten better. I don't think it's gone away. And I think the world did all right. I had someone arguing with me just the other day that without people using these things to their advantages, people, groups like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts would have never created America in the first place. That we wouldn't be the country we are today if people weren't able to exploit those systems.
Well, yeah, I think I know what you're referring to there. There's actually a book called The Myth of the Robber Barons that kind of touches on how prices came down so much. I think I mentioned this actually in an earlier episode. But prices came down so much due to the Rockefellers and so on that they were not at all robber barons in terms of taking advantage of the people and making huge amounts of wealth at the expense of the people. But as you point out, they may have done it at the expense of the workers sometimes. Although some of them created these worker housing paradise kind of things, which sound a bit totalitarian to me, but apparently the workers loved them. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but yes, working conditions were much worse. Obviously, technology wasn't as far ahead as it is today, so they couldn't have made it as good as you would get today, but they certainly could have paid more attention to it probably. Because essentially, they may have to serve the customer well, but they don't have to treat their workers well in order to make a profit. And they tend to be able to make a profit without the worse that they treat their workers, the more profit they might make. And reputation, unfortunately, doesn't tend to play a role in helping them to lose their profit because of how they treat their workers. People will hear about a reputation of a bad product and they'll stop buying it. But if they hear a reputation of a company treating their workers badly, unfortunately, that does not tend to change their buying habits very
Absolutely
much.
Correct. So, I completely agree. Yeah. And that's part of Ferengi culture. So that plays into my whole point that I believe this could be true. And also, like you said, even if they have this bad reputation, but there's still only that 1 to 5% of the merchants in this universe.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last point.
Because, yes, I understand that doesn't really play into it, but that does play into their culture. They do treat their employees terribly. Yeah. And in doing so, even with their reputation is tanking. Right. Like you said, companies like Enron or whatever, they're the 1 to 5, let's go high side number 5% of the population. So you still have 95% of the companies doing the right thing. But these bad companies still did their job well. They still existed for a very long time until regulation caught with them. If you look at Wall Street, you had a lot of people doing a lot of shady deals, a lot of, Ponzi schemes. I'm sorry, I couldn't think of the name. A lot of people doing Ponzi. One of the guys was the head of the SEC for a while. Sure. When Bernie Madoff.
Well, regulatory capture. You have a lot of times, that's one of the big problems with regulation, is that it tends to often get captured by companies. They call it regulatory capture. It's very common, where basically the companies and the government agency ends up in bed together. And that's why regulation often doesn't work. And, that's not to say that a good regulation wouldn't be a good idea. But one of the problems with existing regulations are often that they end up actually doing harm or, making one company into a monopoly, or helping them out, or finding new ways for both the company and sometimes the regulators to do well out of it.
Correct. It's not really the regulation that fails. It's the system itself that the regulation sits in. But individual regulations end up being, bad. And that's why, and then some people call for deregulation for one reason, some call for it for another, or changing the regulation and so on. But it becomes this big tangled mess where you can't just assume because the regulation sounds good that it actually is good. Okay, but with all that said, we're talking about reputation and we jumped a little into workers' rights and how that doesn't really play into the market itself. But do you believe that their greed is what's making them peaceful, or that it's just two separate entities that aren't, they don't actually, one has nothing to do with the other. They could have been very greedy and very warlike. They just happen to be peaceful and greedy. Right.
So this is a really important and kind of a big topic. Adam Smith made some arguments about this, but I think Austrians took it a lot further and basically said that free markets do lead to peace, and they do for a couple of reasons. In fact, I've just been reading the book Trekonomics, which I highly recommend, and in that, Manu Sadia, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but the author of Trekonomics, makes the comment that he believes that the Ferengi, that the reason that they're peaceful in a sense is because of due commerce. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But D-O-U-X, from the French commerce. And the way that he describes it in the book, I disagree with him on a couple of points, because the way that he describes it in the book is essentially that free markets lead to prosperity and consumerism and such, and including like buying luxuries, but also having enough to pay for yourself. And that makes people more peaceful because they care about having their stuff, and therefore they don't want to give it up, and they don't want to be violent, and they're more interested in having a nice, abundant, luxurious, happy life. So I disagree on 2 counts. One, I don't think that's the primary reason that free markets lead to peace in particular. And 2, I don't think that actually describes due commerce very well. And maybe he simply didn't go into it in enough detail for me or something like that. And it's a fantastic book. And he makes some really great economics points, actually, in describing the Federation economy. But on this particular thing, I think he's missing the point a little bit. So if you look at do commerce the way that it's described by others, the way that they explain it is that essentially, and this is also what Austrians argue, that essentially that free markets and so forth and commerce is like with the invisible hand. It leads people to be more faithful to their word, in Adam Smith's words. Adam Smith says, when a person makes perhaps 20 contracts in a day, he cannot gain so much by endeavoring to impose upon his neighbors as the very appearance of a cheat would make him lose. So again, he has to be good to his customers, as I was saying before, to do with reputation and so forth. If he, and just, an individual customer, if he cheats them one day, they're not going to come back another day. Which also you can connect to the idea of game theory and repeated interactions. So in game theory, if you cheat, you might earn more. You might get a better reward from it. But if you have a repeated game, then you don't end up winning. Robert Axelrod describes this in his book, The Evolution of Cooperation. He has 2 books, and that's the follow-up, and that goes into more detail about the whole idea of reputation and repeated games and so forth. So this connects to, as I say, the invisible hand and bourgeois virtues, as they call it. And so Austrians speak about this a lot. So I think he misrepresented du commerce a bit in that way, but Austrians also take it even further because they describe not only how the individuals and therefore the culture change from the use of free markets, but also the effect on the state. So states, when they trade with each other, when people trade with each other and states, allow them to and create free trade agreements, this also changes the incentives for the state to go to war. So if you don't have free trade, then the best way to get more resources, or the only way to get more resources, is through expansion. And so states will be more likely to invade and expand. But if you have free trade, then that's not only another way to increase your resources, but it's also probably a cheaper way, a more efficient way to do it. And going to war would put that at risk. So, and again, I don't think this has gone into very much into economics. And, so that's my little contention there with it. But I think it's a very important thing. And I think it explains why the Ferengi are a peaceful culture. And this is made very clear, actually, in the Maquis, Part 2. Quark explains to a Vulcan about this idea. He uses the 3rd rule of acquisition to convince the Vulcan, who's working with the Maquis, that peace at any price, which is what she's calling for, is illogical. So he says to her, he explains that the 3rd rule of acquisition is never spend more for an acquisition than you have to. And she says, logical, but I fail to see how that applies to my situation. And Quark says, you want to acquire peace. Fine, peace is good. But how much are you willing to pay for it? She says, whatever it costs. Quark says, that's the kind of irresponsible spending that causes so many business ventures to fail. You're forgetting the 3rd rule. Right now, peace could be bought at a bargain price, and you don't even realize it. She says, I find this very confusing. Quark says, then I'll make it so simple even a Vulcan can understand. The Central Command has been caught red-handed smuggling weapons to their settlers. So every ship that approaches the demilitarized zone will be searched. Without the support of the Central Command, the Cardassian settlers won't be so eager to fight. Sarkana says, you forget the weapons they already have. Quark says, they have weapons, you have weapons, everyone has weapons. But right now, no one has a clear advantage. So the price of peace is at an all-time low. This is the perfect time to sit down and hammer out an agreement. Don't you get it? Attacking the Cardassians now will only escalate the conflict and make peace more expensive in the long run. Now, I ask you, is that logical? Right? So Quark fully understands that peace is something you can acquire, and that you should acquire it at the cheapest price. So when you have a state that it would normally be willing to go to war, to expand, to get more resources and so forth, if actually they could have free trade, they can have the same resources. Why would they do something that is expensive, like war, when they could have their resources another way. It's not exactly the same as what he's saying here, but it's economic logic, and he clearly understands it. And Ferengi in general clearly understand that war is destructive. They don't want to do it. They want profit. And if you put profit first, doing something that's destructive where you lose resources is not something they're going to want. Right? Does that make sense, or did I use this quote out of context?
No, it makes sense. I just don't necessarily agree with it.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, they want to do arms deals sometimes. There are times when the economic logic is in favor of them doing violent things, but it's not the common thing. I don't think Ferenginar wants to go to war. Even arms deals don't necessarily mean they care about being violent. They're going to make their money. If someone else has got it in their head that they're going to go to war, whether it's profitable or not, the Ferengi are going to find a way to profit off it. But I don't think in any way, shape, or form that their greediness and their peacefulness are tied together. I think that they happen to be peaceful and they happen to be greedy and they happen to find a way to make it work for themselves, because if the price of peace was too high, they wouldn't be peaceful anymore and they'd be violent. It just so happens that at the moment, it's not that way. That there are plenty of races willing to create free trade deals.
Well, but that kind of supports my argument. If what you're saying is that as long as
it supports your argument. Hold on. Well, can I finish my statement? Okay. It supports your statement now. But if tomorrow these races decide they don't want anything to do with them, they have to change their way. They wouldn't be peaceful for the sake of profit. They would be warlike for the sake of profit. I just think that this race isn't warlike. I think there's been plenty of instances throughout history where we've watched people go to war to create more profit. Even if they were able to get good deals, they wanted better deals. And they didn't think of the cost of the war itself. Not to mention there's also a profit in war if you make the weapons.
Okay. But so when I said that you supported my statement, what I meant is that you said if there were people willing to do the free trade, then they would do that. What I was saying is sort of that, that therefore you're supporting the idea that free trade itself can help create peace, because if people are willing to do it, i.e. if you have that free trade, then you're less likely to have war. And so if the problem is that other countries are not willing, or other planets are not willing to do the free trade, then I mean, if they're not willing to do free trade, then the problem is not that free trade won't help peace. The problem is that your other neighbors are not willing to do the free trade in the first place. But your other point is interesting. Is there a chance that war can be more profitable than free trade? And that's a question. And if you look to someone like Keynes, who, we could look for the original Klingon on this. Maybe it'll explain him better in a way that makes more sense. But Keynes says that that war is profitable. He said that World War II created economic growth. Now, I strongly disagree with this, as does the Austrians. I think that it may have increased GDP, but there are many reasons why that could be. In other words, that can be an accounting thing. That could be not factual, but just numbers on a page. For various reasons, GDP is often not an actual good sign of the actual economic growth or economic output in an economy. And also you have to look at long-term versus short-term, and you also have to look at lives, obviously. And GDP per capita, if you lose a lot of those capitas, can look, inflated. So in any case, war is highly destructive. And I believe that the Ferengi understand that, and they care about profit much more than other races. So other races might look at it and say, oh yeah, war is really good for us for all of these reasons. And they don't notice or they don't count the destruction. But I think Ferengi do count the destruction, and they're chicken. You look at them, they never want to get in a fight. They never want to put their lives at risk because they're selfish and they care about their own lives. They don't want to die. They want to live because that's part of their profit, their self-interest, right? They care about themselves.
No, I agree with that. I just don't think the greed part is what makes them necessarily peaceful. I think they work well together for that race. I just don't think one is, and one may even be influenced by the other. I just don't think it's a 1-to-1 ratio.
Okay. Fair enough.
I think that we've seen plenty of times
and
where
they do have
people
two.
were willing.
Sorry.
No,
I was
go
going to
ahead.
say that they do have two rules of acquisition. War is good for business and peace is good for business. One after the other. I forget. 25 and 26.
They seem to make rules of acquisition that can basically apply to any time they can make profit to do it. So they wouldn't necessarily be against someone else's war, because that's really what they mean by war is good for business. They don't, again, like you said, they don't really want to go to war necessarily, but
one of their rules is that the closer to the front lines you get, the less good it is for business.
Yeah, well, because you're going to die. Yeah. And you can't create business if you're dead.
And so, as you say, someone else's war, a war that you can stay far away from the front lines, is definitely better.
As long as I'm supplying the front lines, it doesn't matter whatever else. So, are they necessarily peaceful, or are they just afraid to get into war themselves? Is a bit different.
Sure.
Than if the peacefulness created the greed created the peacefulness.
Right.
Like I would imagine they would love a war in the Gamma Quadrant when they're not there.
Okay. Well,
if they could supply it.
Right. Well, taking this question to the next stage then, and I have a feeling, again, that you might be a little more skeptical about this Austrian idea about free trade and markets being good for peace. But so another episode that comes to mind is it's called the Jem'Hadar, obviously DS9 episode. And Quark is talking to Sisko. You know, he keeps accusing Sisko of not liking the Ferengi. And so he's defending the Ferengi, and he says, the way I see it, humans used to be a lot like Ferengi. Greedy, acquisitive, interested only in profit. We're a constant reminder of your past that you'd like to forget. Sisko says, Quark, we don't have time for this. Quark goes on, but you're overlooking something. Humans used to be a lot worse than the Ferengi. Slavery, concentration camps, interstellar wars. We have nothing in our past that approaches that kind of barbarism. You see, we're nothing like you. We're better. So, and then he says, now, if you'll excuse me, I have a lock to pick. He goes ahead and still helps out Sisko. Anyway, I think this is really interesting because first of all, he gives us a little bit of past. He says that the Ferengi never had things like that, slavery, concentration camps, and so forth, that we have in our past. And I wonder why. I mean, they do, talking about things that are not so great about the Ferengi, half of their entire society is essentially like slaves in a sense. They're women. And, you know, females are not allowed to wear clothing, not allowed to go outside by themselves or open businesses, which is what they're all about, obviously. So you do have a huge thing that can be overlooked, or has so far in this podcast not even been discussed. So, I mean, that's a huge, huge thing, but they do have quite a different past to us, in which they don't have wars and concentration camps, massive, you know, deaths on that kind of scale, and slavery of a more explicit type, and that involves men. You only have the kind of slavery that you have within the sort of domestic side of it, you know, as much as that could be considered slavery, which perhaps obviously it could be considered a bit different. But so do you think none of this has to do with their profit and markets either? Or do you think this is unrealistic, or what do you think?
Well, I think first off, what he quotes to Sisko, my interpretation of it, and maybe I'm wrong, my interpretation of it is that the peacefulness actually doesn't bring on, the profit doesn't bring on the peacefulness, because for one, the slave trade, let's say, was actually just that. It was bringing slaves over so they could trade for rum, or for sugar, for rum, and so on and so forth. Had a lot to do with that. And that was actually a free trade system. It just so happened that they completely devalued a group of human beings into being just a product. But more so, yeah, it's very interesting that Quark goes on that rant, and meanwhile, they treat their women the way they do. Because they treat them, and I'm going to use the term subhuman, but I guess it would be sub-Ferengi, but they treat them as sub-Ferengis. They're not equals in any way. They're not even close to equals. And we still have parts of populations that believe people aren't equal, no matter how much we've tried to get past that. But here, it couldn't be more obvious. It couldn't be more in your face. When Quark's mother starts to change that society actually starts to revolt against her and the Grand Negus.
Yeah. And, it occurred to me the other day, I wonder if one of the reasons why they don't want women to trade, because I mean, you learn in one of the episodes the sort of economic lesson, if women were more part of the society, it would be good for the economy, for the men even, for their profit. They could sell more things to them and so forth. That's in that one that everyone hates where Quark dresses up as a woman.
Yes.
One of the times I saw it recently, I actually thought is a lot better than is given credit for, and especially for that kind of economic argument in it. But in any case, what was I going to say? Oh, it occurred to me the other day that one of the reasons why they might not want women to be involved in it is because all you have to do, at least for Quark, is sort of like touch his ear a little bit and and all of a sudden he gives you a really good deal instead of trying to rip you off. So maybe if women were involved in business, they would just dominate so much because they could take advantage of men in that way.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Yeah.
It goes to such an extreme. It's a little bit ridiculous, but don't we kind of feel that way about society anyway in general?
Well, and sometimes
that's at least one of the undertones people speak of. Maybe not to this extreme, but that women can kind of use their sexuality just to get away with anything they want with men. So this is, again, Star Trek being Star Trek. They exaggerate it to the nth degree and show it. But we see it way before them. We see it way before Quark even, because we see it in The Next Generation in season 6 episode, I can't remember the name, Chain of Command, part 1 and part 2, where Picard loses command of the Enterprise. Him, Beverly Crusher, and Worf have to go on a mission, and they have to get to Cardassian space. They obviously can't take a runabout, so when they go to get someone to ferry them, it's, and I can't remember the Ferengi's name, but it's a Ferengi. And he basically says, I'm not dealing with Federation spies. And Beverly kind of talks nice to him and rubs his ear, and now they're on a transport going into Cardassian space. Right. And it was that simple. Right, true. And actually, you see Lwaxana Troi as well taking advantage of her Ferengi using sexuality as well, I think, in a TNG episode. And it's a narrative in many contemporary shows, movies, plays throughout the history of our society.
Sure, and it could be used in quite a sexist way, accusing women of using their sexuality in that way. And I mean, you could see it either way, because you could also see it as the dumb men who fall for it.
It all depends on how it's presented. I mean,
sure.
It's presented in such a way that maybe in the past, in Ferengi culture, that the men are just dumb. And actually the women would be much better at business, but because they were able to beat the women over the head, maybe there was twice as many men as there was women at one point, that they took control. Who knows? They don't give you enough backstory before TNG to know how the society developed into what it is.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, that's kind of my take on the whole, that thing. But one of the points is you're actually limiting completely, and it's not just limiting, you're negating all the rights of a portion of a population.
Yeah.
So that the other portion not only has the rights, they have more rights than they would have originally.
Right. Exactly. There was a time not very long ago where in America it was not only women and slaves, but it was actually everyone except for a few white men with property who had basically any rights.
Correct. If you didn't own property, you didn't vote. So just being white didn't do it for you. You had to actually also own land.
Right. You couldn't be, the native population or any minority or women or anyone that didn't have property. So it was a tiny portion.
Yeah, it was a convenient set of laws that made it so that only one type of person could buy land, and then only that person could have rights.
Right.
And then the more land you had, the more rights you had.
Right.
The more power you had over the site. Even if technically our vote was 1-to-1, if you owned a ton of land, you had a lot more influence on the people, so you had much more say over what happened.
Sure, and a bit of that has remained, and that's one of the problems with the idea of a free market economy, is that you need to have a base of opportunity and rights equality. Otherwise, what you have is those with more wealth. We spoke about in that episode that we named after this idea, about starting right now, libertarianism starting right now, because essentially if, the whole free market thing, the wealth accumulates. It's the same type of thing as interest accumulation. Essentially, if you have a lot of wealth, you build on that. And so all of the power that you get in a society can come from wealth if you're allowed to sort of buy any kind of power, even if, at first all you're buying is non-political power. If you can then use some of that wealth to buy off one politician or something, it begins to be the ability to buy more rights over time, essentially. And this is also the problem with anarcho-capitalism, because you can say, let's, make the government perfect and small and not, impose anything on people. But if you're allowed to buy through just a personal exchange with someone, even if it's not a legal thing, even if legally the government is not allowed to help you out, if you're able to buy a little bit from one person who's tied to the government, essentially it kind of builds and builds and builds until political power is bought through wealth.
Right, absolutely. And in our past, it was, you didn't necessarily have to pay for it, but you'd trade land, or you had land, or you'd give something with your land. But we could see that then spreading to a culture, a global culture. We still see that to some degree, where some countries hold more say in, say, the UN than other countries, just by nature of their vast power and the trading ability or whatnot. And then you extrapolate that out again, and you would be in the universe where humans would have so much and Vulcans would have so much say, and there might be little pockets of people who have basically no say. Much like the people who live on the planet our show is named after in the Briar Patch. They virtually had no say because they had left the larger society to create their own smaller society. And then when people found them, they basically thought, well, we can do anything we want with these people. No one even cares about them.
Yeah. I don't want to go off on too big of a tangent here. We could even do a whole episode on it, but the Ferengi and anarcho-capitalism, there's actually a brilliant connection there that would explain what I just said, because I don't even know if it made a lot of sense the way that I said it about buying power.
It did. It did. Most people, that's one of the few things most people do understand, even if they've never had an economics class in their life, because we've seen it.
Right.
If we haven't seen it, we believe that every politician is bought by some corporation, right? I mean,
right. Yeah, it's definitely a belief, isn't it?
You have laws in this country that definitely benefit corporations when it comes to donating money to politicians, because they just have more money to donate. So it's obvious they're going to donate more than you. Whether that politician does more for them or not is another story. The perception is always going to be, my $5 is not as good as Walmart's, 500,000. It's just not.
Right. Well, just to throw it out there, there's an episode called Body Parts in DS9 in which, Quark believes that he has a fatal disease. And so based on Ferengi sort of custom / just another way of earning money.
I love this episode, by the way. Go ahead.
Yeah. So he decides to put his body on the exchange, desiccated remains on the exchange, and it's bought by someone, and he's super happy about this, even though he's going to die. But then it turns out that he doesn't have the disease. So he gets excited because he gets to sue his doctor, which we never find out if that actually worked. But
that was very weird, because he was upset he wasn't dying. Then he was happy he was suing a doctor, and then go on.
Yeah. And then he says, oh, and I'm going to live. But yeah, so the problem here is that he already put his body on the exchange. And so he would have to violate. Sorry? And
it was bought.
Right.
If it wasn't bought, he could pull it off the exchange. But if someone had already bought every piece of it.
Exactly. Yeah. So he would have to actually violate the contract with the buyer in order to not have to kill himself or get killed or whatever, so that the buyer could have his body. So you get this entire episode practically where he's struggling with this issue. And the interesting thing for anarcho-capitalism, the connection here, is that this trick is the trick could be against the law, but only if you have a government to enforce that law. Anarcho-capitalists talk about private security companies to enforce the law, but if they're private, someone could do a trick with them. This kind of swindle, this kind of trick may be a lot easier if everything is private and everything is based on money and being able to buy it. So someone who's a lot richer will be a lot more likely to get away with these kind of tricks, swindles, than someone who's poor. And so if you don't have an overarching government, wouldn't it be much easier with all of these individual private things and people with a lot of money and people with no money or very little money? You would have an inequality there that would probably be a lot greater. The ability to use the inequality in wealth, as well as possibly a greater inequality in wealth, but even putting that aside, the ability to make use of this inequality in order to swindle people and gain more power, it seems a lot more possible under a system like anarcho-capitalism. Does that make sense?
No, I actually completely agree with that whole theory. And I think Voyager also, we talked about an episode during our essentials that talked about this whole where the prisoners, basically the whole system revolved around how the family feels you should be punished. So
right.
These two concepts, not concepts, but these, the Ferengi, that, and there's a few other examples. I think we could definitely get into a much larger, broader debate about anarchy capitalists, in general. So I don't want to go diving too deep into that theory right now, but I think.
Yeah, but that would be great to have an episode on it.
Absolutely. But I think that proves these points about the Ferengi even more. I think it definitely shows their mindset and their culture and how this works because they're even, like you said, they're even willing, or we believe they're even willing to sabotage themselves profit to keep onto their particular power in their society. Because as we see in a later episode of DS9, that all the Grand Negus's biggest deals were created by Quark's mom.
Right.
She was the one behind it. He was basically a buffoon.
Which, by the way, I hear actually is true of Trump. You know, when Trump suddenly all of his businesses went south, I hear that's because he had divorced from his first wife, who was actually in charge of all of his business deals. Just as a side note.
That's interesting. I'd like to.
I don't know that for sure.
But it seems like the timelines might fit. I just don't know the dates.
Yeah.
That would work out. I mean, on a funnier note, the reason why George Carlin's comedy went bad was because his wife passed away and stopped writing his jokes. But it's just a side note. I just always found it interesting that she wrote all his material, and I'm a huge Carlin fan, so I'm going to plug it in here, even though it has nothing to do with anything. So,
well, it does kind of fit. Anyway, so were you done with your point on anarcho-capitalism?
Yeah, I think that kind of covers it. I mean, I'm definitely. I can have these conversations, but I'm definitely more of the sociological side, which isn't really playing into this except for the whole role of women in the society. And even that seems like a monetary one anyway. So this isn't really the episode you're going to get a lot of great nuggets from me, maybe. But yeah, I'll add where I can.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't know if we've really done justice to the whole idea of I assume about 50% of the society of Ferengi having no rights, but we've given it some airtime at least, which I think is really important. It's often, I think, overlooked when people are talking about the Ferengi.
Well, I think there's a few reasons for that. One, sometimes people don't want to just don't want to talk about that kind of topic in general. Another issue with it is it's really not brought up much. We don't really see women in their society because they're not allowed out.
I think it's brought up quite a bit.
It's brought up only in episodes where women show up, when the mother shows up and such, because even in that they have the Dabo girls, right, who they obviously don't treat as equals, but they're definitely not treated as bad as a Ferengi woman. They're allowed to wear clothes at work and stuff like that. And you don't really, the vast majority, we see Quark in every episode. We don't bring up women in every episode. We see Rom in almost every episode. You don't really think about it because you're not, there's no women being mistreated on the screen for you to debate about.
Except for the episode where you have the guy who dresses up as a woman in order to be able to make profit, right? And falls in love with Quark.
Yes. No, that's true. But again,
and of course the episode where Quark dresses up as a woman.
Right. And the episode where the mother is doing all the deals for the Grand Negus. But we're talking about 3 episodes out of over 700 episodes of Star Trek. So it's not a grand scheme. Even if you just take Voyager, there was 170 some odd episodes of Star Trek, Voyager.
Well, you only had the Ferengi in a couple, or in one that I can think of.
Voyager? I'm sorry, of DS9.
DS9.
Voyager. DS9, yeah. You're talking about 3 episodes out of DS9 that was 100 and something episodes. So it's not a mainstay of what you think of when you think Ferengi. If it was made to be a bigger point every time they were on screen, Because even when they talk about not trusting them, when Picard does it, when Sisko does it, they never bring that point up.
Sure.
So it's not a thing you think of naturally unless you think of those select episodes.
Yeah, and I don't like Dax's attitude to it either. She only mentions it in the episode where, I forget the name, where the guy Ferengi dresses up as a woman and falls in love with Quark. You know, other times when she talks about the Ferengi, she says, they're greedy, they're selfish, and they don't treat their women very well. But she says it almost like it's, it's a really minor point, but she likes them anyway.
Yeah,
and that bothers me.
I don't know. I guess thinking about it now, maybe that should bother me more than it does, but it doesn't. And I think the reason why it doesn't bother me, her reaction to it, is because Dax has all the memories of all her past people, and we've seen that they're not exactly the nicest people Dax has been in.
Well, a couple of them, yeah.
So the memories aren't the greatest, and some were very much womenizers. So we don't know to what extent she understands how the women are treated either.
Well, but she's also been many women. She's been quite a few women in her life.
Yes, but it seems to always go back to the one that Sisko is best friends with, is dominating her personality quite often.
It's true. He does seem to dominate her personality a lot, and we find out she's in love with him.
Yes, and that's another great episode for another time. So
yeah,
let's not delve out deep into that one. But no, you're right. It is a kind of an odd answer, and it just goes to more proof on why people don't necessarily think so much about the treatment itself of women in that society, because even Star Trek kind of just blows it off.
Yeah,
they don't harp on it. When you talk about Klingons, no matter what Klingons are doing, they're warlike. So you think warlike.
Right.
When you talk about Vulcans, no matter what they're doing, they're logical. Romulans are sketchy. They're always trying to sneak behind your back. These things are universal truths. The universal truth about the Ferengi is greed.
Right.
It's not women, not the treatment of women and how poor it is.
Right. That's a very good point.
But as I was saying a minute ago, my focus is more of the social aspect, the way the society is run, such like that. Here we actually have a good example of that in Nog, Rom, and Quark. They're not prototypical Ferengis, and I believe it's because you've taken them and their culture and folded it into other cultures over time, and that's caused them to change their culture. Not completely. They still believe their beliefs, and even Nog and Rom, who want to be more Starfleet orientated, they still do believe in many of the things that a good Ferengi would believe in, but just not quite as much as Quark does anymore. And Quark's not quite as greedy as Quark makes Quark out to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think Nog is a very interesting, or Rom is really interesting because he, in the first couple of seasons, and some people, of course, blame the writers or say that he hasn't developed as a character, but let's take him as who he is. In the beginning, he was clearly trying to be a good Ferengi. He didn't really think he had a choice, I think, and he was just trying to fake it until he makes it and trying to do what he was supposed to do as a good Ferengi and really pushing that. And even when he was going to marry Lita, he fell back on that when he heard Dax, I think, say, a good Ferengi would never do that. It offended him, it hurt him, and it made him think he had to be a good Ferengi. And I think he really was not only not good at business, but he didn't even like it. He didn't want to do it. He was just thought he should, and he really was trying to be a good Ferengi. Whereas I think Nog, even as a Starfleet person, even though that's what he wanted to do, he still got really excited when he could use his Ferengi skills in one way or another, to help with Jake or to help, O'Brien, thank you, acquire, to get the resources. So Rom is really interesting because you see that he was a failure as a Ferengi and he really didn't want to be a Ferengi, but he really wanted to try. And it was only when he sort of started to figure out that he was living on a Federation Bajoran space station and could actually do something else that he started, first he actually stood up to Quark and created a union, and that gave him confidence, realizing he could go against Ferengi culture. And then with that confidence and that realization that he could do something else, he became an engineer, and then he had his confidence, and it completely changed his personality. So you can see from that how the Ferengi culture was squashing people's personalities. It was destroying people's lives. It was stopping people from being able to blossom and become themselves. And that's one of the lessons of Star Trek, is that the system that we live in, the culture and the economic system, that, all of that can destroy a person, can hold a person back. And when that person is able to get past that, when you have an end to scarcity and when you have this kind of new system, people blossom and it changes them. And it not only changes them in the sense that maybe they'll be less greedy and acquisitive, but they also can really bloom and become a person who then is valuable to the society in a way that they never were before because they didn't fit into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think looking at them as a case study is a great idea for a few reasons, but mostly though but again, even when they leave that ideology behind, they don't fully leave it, because when the mother wants to wear clothes, the whole family has a problem with it. I mean, they don't show the son, but
it's not easy to give up a culture that you've lived in for your whole life.
These are their beliefs, and that's just the way it is. So even in a society where the number 2 of the space station is a female, and Quark and Rom and Nog have all been dealing with her in very professional manners, it's hard to see their mother go against their beliefs.
Yeah.
And that causes problems. And there's other examples of that throughout the show. I think the main ones is, like you said, was it Nog that had to work with O'Brien to get back the desk at one point. And I mean, that was a great episode, going around in circles trying to get all, trading one item for another item, one item to get back that item, another item to get back that item. And at the end, it's like nothing ever happened, but they somehow got extra stuff for the war, because they ended up getting all their stuff back.
Yeah. And that's how trade works. Both parties can be made better off. It's mutually beneficial exchange, because one person has one thing, one person has another, but the thing that they have, they don't need or want. And the thing the other person has, they do need or want. And so the trade is beneficial. So I'm sure they did have to give up certain things, but it wasn't things that they particularly needed or cared about.
No, I just found it interesting that they kept causing themselves a problem.
Yes.
Till the very end, when finally they sorted it all out, and everything seemed to be exactly how it was at the start.
Right. Well, yeah, but again, that's barter, and that's the reason that we have money, is so that you don't have to make 10 different trades along the way. But yeah, he had to make these trades along the way that weren't necessarily beneficial, but he knew the item that he was getting, he could then use in the next trade. And
right. It was very interesting.
It was great.
I liked it a lot. And this is someone who was trained by Starfleet. So,
but
this
he
was
had
not
his
a Starfleet.
Ferengi, yeah.
Right. This wasn't a Starfleet issue. This was a cultural issue. Something he grew up with.
Yeah.
Like I would grow up with a cartoon like Sesame Street. He grew up with books on how to trade and get the best deal.
Yeah. Acquire.
Yes.
Yeah, the kids' book. And culture stays with you, but culture is also something that can be changed. Changing an entire society's culture is extremely difficult, but changing an individual, if they're immersed in a different culture, is far easier. But I was wondering to myself, do the Ferengi change more easily? Looking at, our main ones are all from one family, so it's not a great sample. It's not a representative of an entire culture, really, because it's all from one family. But Nog, Rom, and Quark, were they more able to change when immersed in Federation culture than you would expect from a Klingon or a Cardassian? Of course, Worf was raised by humans, so we can't really look at him. We don't have very many examples to look at. But I was thinking they must have changed more easily than, say, a Cardassian. But then I was thinking about Garak. And of course, we don't know how much he changed, but he did seem to change somewhat when immersed in the sort of Federation culture.
He did. I don't necessarily know if let's say the Ferengi changed more easily, but I think it does seem to look that way, because one of the big things is profit. And if I can't make any profit as a Ferengi, it's actually better off for me to stop being one. It's actually, if I can make,
but
and
then
they don't
you could
make
say
money,
the same about Garak. I mean, if it's not beneficial for him to be power-hungry spy and a killer and an assassin, is
but
it,
what I mean is,
better to
Ferengi,
turn into a Federation?
No, because what I mean is Ferengi ideals would actually tell you.
Right.
That it's more profitable to just play the role of a Federation officer member, even though one wasn't a Federation member. He was actually part of the Bajoran side of that. But that's semantics, really. But it would actually be more profitable for Ram and Nog, if they can't be good Ferengi, to not try and be good Ferengi and just go make the profits they can by being good Starfleet members and Alliance members.
Yeah.
That's actually a better way of life, because Ram and Nog are never going to get ahead in Ferengi culture.
Right.
So maybe it's actually harder for them to not be Ferengis, but it appears easier because, one of the ways of making profit, the way they do, swindling people, would be to convince people you're something you're not.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
Or they could actually just become, whatever. They could become Starfleet members and not be swindling them, but that's kind of what their culture is.
Yeah. No,
do.
they're certainly not swindling, I don't think. But you're right that in a sense they were still Ferengi. They were just, they realized that their most profitable choice was actually to
not be Ferengi.
Yeah.
Whereas a Klingon is going to be a Klingon. Worf was raised not Klingon and more Klingon than Ram and Nog were Ferengi. Raised Ferengi.
Yeah. Yeah. Worf is, that's definitely an interesting episode for another time on, I guess, culture and Klingons and the way, cause Worf was like a Klingon by the books. In a sense, he was more Klingon than the Klingons, but the actual Klingons are actually Klingon, and he was nothing like them. Or he is nothing like them. He will be nothing like them.
Yes, he was the quintessential never correct Klingon. But
he was always correct. He was always correctly Klingon by the books, but he was never
right.
Klingon.
Well, that's what I mean, in reality.
Yeah.
It never really worked in reality, and they never saw him as it, so.
Well, by the end, he was definitely accepted. He was accepted into a house, and he was definitely accepted. And in the end, he became what's the word?
Ambassador?
Yes, that's the word, ambassador.
There you go. So anyway, we're coming up on an hour now. Do you have any final thoughts on the Ferengi and their culture?
Oh, there's just so much. But yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation. I guess one thing that we didn't talk about quite as much as I expected is how Ferenginar, from the beginning of, just like the Federation, from the beginning of when we meet them, it is really a post-scarcity society, I would think. And Quark is never worried about when he's worried about going bankrupt, he's not worried about, not being able to eat, even if he was living on Ferenginar, I think. Although I'm not certain about that. And maybe that's why it's become mercantilist, in a sense, an exaggerated mercantile culture rather than an exaggerated capitalist as we see it today culture, in a sense, because it's kind of this post-scarcity world, and they're following profit and doing trades buy low, sell high, and swindling rather than the kind of creating a business, entrepreneurial kind of thing that we see today. This isn't really a wrap-up. This is kind of a whole nother topic in a sense, but I realized that we didn't speak about it. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Not particularly in that exact topic.
Well, yeah, you did say that you're not quite as much on the economics as I am.
Right, that's not really my I kind of said all the economic terms I know at this point for the Ferengi.
Right.
So I could throw out random ones, trickle down, and then, all right, we're done. I got them all. So.
All right. Well, I do think it's an interesting topic to think about all right, I actually wrote something about this most of our listeners are not probably as into economics as I have been, but my most recent book is called The Driving Force of the Collective, and it's quite an academic book, but I included an appendix, or a few appendixes, and they're a lot more light. They're not, as opposed to most appendixes, which get actually more heavy into data and details. My appendixes they're much more light. They're much more literary. And one of them is called, Obituary for History, Scarcity, Communism, and the Modern Myth of the Ferengi. And it's all about the Ferengi. So I could put this online somewhere if people are interested. But I talk a lot about the the economics of the Ferengi, obviously. And there was a podcast that I listened to in which someone was talking about economic man, Homo economicus, and connected it to of all species to the Vulcans. And so I wrote about how that's not quite correct, that probably if you're thinking about economic man, you might want to think about the Ferengi, not the Vulcans. But it's an interesting question because obviously Vulcans being logical and this idea of economic man, which is essentially this idea of the rational person who chooses the lower price instead of the higher price and does this kind of rational thing. It does kind of connect to the Vulcans. But it's not, but rational economic man is also about self-interest and profit, and that connects them obviously to the Ferengi. But in this appendix, I wrote a little bit about this idea of the post-scarcity society and what that means for how the Ferengi culture and social system might have evolved. I might just read a little piece of this to help us cover this topic real quick before we finish up. Post-scarcity is that basic needs no longer, this is a quote, that basic needs no longer need to be rationed, whether by money or some other means, and people no longer need to be forced to work. And then I quote from, actually it's a Reddit post. There is a Reddit thread all about the post-scarcity society and the Ferengi is a very good post. I could also put that link up somewhere if people are interested. And I quote from this. The Ferengi appear to be the arch-capitalists of the Star Trek universe, obsessed with acquisition and accumulation of wealth. I propose, however, that they are not capitalists in the same sense as contemporary humans are. First, contemporary capitalism functions by forcing the majority of human beings to participate in the system by selling their labor or else face poverty, and perhaps even starvation. We have no sign that this holds for Ferengi. So again, as I said, Quark worries about losing his fortune but not becoming homeless. I would suggest that this is because the Ferengi are like Star Trek Earth, a post-scarcity society, where technological advances have rendered it irrational to be stingy and competitive in the distribution of basic needs. So I don't know. I wonder if this is actually true for the Ferengi. Would it be more rational for their society to ensure that all Ferengi have their basic needs met? Or would they want to force them, as in a sense people talk about today, forcing people to work is good because it means that everyone will work, which will mean more economic abundance. So that's an interesting question. The Ferengi they don't care about other people, they only care about profit and their own selves. So I wonder, as a society, would it be rational for them to try to force Ferengi to always have to work? Or would it be more rational? Would they end up getting, more profit for their society out of making sure that people are able to eat and so forth so that they can then go out and produce things and make profit? It seems like, in a sense, they would be less likely to do that because they're not so worried. It doesn't seem like they're so worried about making sure that everyone is productive. They're more concerned about making a quick buck. But I wonder, again, as I said before, maybe that's because they're post-scarcity, and so they don't have to worry about production and so forth. They only need to think about themselves and making a quick buck. So it's sort of a cause and effect question. Did post-scarcity come first, and that's why they act the way they do? Or do they act the way they do, and therefore they wouldn't worry about... I don't know. It's an interesting question. It's just something to think about. So there are no signs that the Ferengi brand of capitalism depends primarily on labor exploitation. And so as I was just saying, it says here, the majority of Ferengi commerce consists of buy low, sell high schemes, more reminiscent of mercantilism than classic industrial capitalism. But the question is why? Is that because of the post-scarcity society or not? I think that's it. I think that's all I have for you today. What else do you want to say?
No, that sounds good. My final thoughts, actually I'd like to bring up one quick one. So we talked about Quark a lot today. And this is not about Ferengis in general, except it's about Quark. It was played by Armin
Shimmerman.
There you go. Who also played the very first Ferengi seen on screen in the very first episode they were in TNG, which was episode 6 of season 1. It was called The Last Outpost.
That's the one.
And he was also in peak performance as a Ferengi as well. Okay. And later got his job as Quark, which is just interesting. It was also recently his birthday, as of the time of this recording. This episode will probably be fairly dated by the time people hear this. It won't be anywhere near his birthday, but it was his birthday.
Why did you know that?
It popped up on my Facebook stream, and I looked into the person who played Quark and found out he was both.
Right.
But so I did notice that it was his birthday, I think today or yesterday. And then I did look up Quark to make sure that they were actually the same people I was thinking of, and then found out he was also all those other people. As far as the episode, my last final thoughts on that, I think we went into a lot of great detail. I think we could take each one of these topics and turn them into their own show, though.
Yeah. I
think we were a little all over the place because there's so much to cover about the Ferengi that these individual topics don't really show a good. It gives a good cross-section of the Ferengi. It doesn't give a good case study of the Ferengi, if that makes sense. I think we will be going back to this quite often. And I think that while it did take a little while to get into Ferengi, seven episodes, I think that it was necessary because, well, maybe not the Essentials episode, except we really wanted to do one. But the other ones were necessary to lay the groundwork for how we feel and what we think that would give reason for this episode even existing. Okay. Because if there's no opposites, what do we care that there's a greedy society if everyone's greedy, or if we thought everything should be greedy, or stuff like that. So I think, and plus it's Star Trek. So if you're just talking about Star Trek, you got to at least give how you feel about the Federation before you give how you feel about anybody else. Because if you can't defend the Federation's stances, even partially, then you're not really going to be giving a fair assessment of how the show saw the Ferengi. Now, we don't have to agree with everything that the Federation does or believes, but if we can't give a proper indication of how we think the show was intending for them to look, we're not really giving a fair assessment of anybody.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much it.
There is actually one more thing that I want to bring up. And again, as you say, each of these things could probably have their own show. And I definitely think this one, I would have liked to go into it in some depth, and I planned to, but then I forgot. and we had a lot of other great things, great chapters in this episode, things to think about. So again, yeah, this is quite a topic, but question, how individualist are the Ferengi? And how does that connect with the other things that we've talked about in terms of whether the Adam Smith version of markets and capitalism and the invisible hand and the Ferengi, economics of that. Are they actually individualist? Did they used to be more, individualist has many meanings in terms of being able to be who you are rather than just individualist in terms of profit seeking and caring only about yourself when it comes to profit. And you have Ferengi obviously being individualist in that profit way and not caring about their families. I mean, they have rules of acquisition saying, don't let family get in the way of profit. Anyway, so they clearly care about themselves and not others, but is that actually individualism? And if we're individualists today in the ways that we think of ourselves as individualists, which includes a lot of things that we don't see in the Ferengi, would it eventually lead, if we care so much about profit that we stop caring about other things because they get in the way of profit, including family, then we could become like the Ferengi, possibly. So this idea of individualism, and we care about it today in part because it's about expressing ourselves, but those who care about more collective ideals argue that some of these individualist things are negative in the way that you could imagine them leading to something like the Ferengi. So again, big topic if we were to get into all of it, but just on a basic level, what do you think?
Yeah, I like it. I think it's actually funny. It reminded me of a quote that has nothing to do with what you were just saying, but it's more of a worker-boss relationship statement. And I would assume the Ferengi believe it wholeheartedly, actually. It's every time I say it's family, you say it's just business. But every time I say it's just business, you say we're family. You're going to be either family or you're going to be taken advantage of depending upon whatever benefits the other person talking at the moment,
That reminds me of some political debates where people switch what they believe in based on.
Correct, right in the middle. It was actually a quote from a sportscaster about a contract some baseball player was going through. But it's true because if a team trades you, it's just business. But if you want to leave for better money, you're leaving the family, and that's true of a lot of business, in general. One of the quotes I remember seeing growing up was, when your boss says it's, we're all family, what he means is you should work for less money than you're worth.
Right.
Like a sister or brother would. Yeah. And it seems like the Ferengi take that statement and really run with it. Yeah. They really, really run with that one.
Yeah. So. Yeah. I mean, but again, we could be a little cynical, or we could be selection biased or whatever, seeing this around us. And maybe it's not as widespread as we think, but it's there. Certainly. But, when we look in other places, we might see other things, people willing to work for free, people willing to give to charity, there are obviously both in the society right now. But yeah, if we focus too much on individualism, will it lead more to that? And it's a question. It's an open question, I suppose. And maybe what we need is the balance. Because obviously if you focus too much on collective things, then you can end up hurting the individual as well. I mean, if you focus on truly collective ideals, the individual falls away. And Vulcans even, that's another connection there where they say, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And that's quite a collectivist ideal.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been fun talking about Ferengi and how they treat their family and business as one and the same so they can rip both off today. But this isn't the only thing we've been discussing on the network. So here's a quick look at some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, the 602 Club.
Oh, huge. Tintin, definitely in Europe and in many, many other countries, in Africa and Asia, is really, honestly, as big as James Bond rolled together with Indiana Jones and Superman.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
First of all, it very much hinges on the existence of subspace, which is also a kind of murky sci-fi term that is used in Star Trek to explain how warp drive works and how you can communicate.
The orb.
And so it makes the relationship between Nog and Jake really important because I think it does really soften Sisko's heart towards the Ferengi. And I think it does the same thing for Rom. Rom, I think, begins to see the ways in which these Federation types actually are different than most Ferengi kind of think of them.
Warp 5.
I like to talk about these things. They're not easy to talk about. This is not an easy discussion to have because of so much stuff that's going on in our society right now. And what's been going on for years. Again, that hashtag, the Me Too, it really opened my eyes, and which is what it was supposed to do. Right? It's exactly what it was supposed to do.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcast. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcast on iPhone, iPad, and Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please leave us a star rating and written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 files from your website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose message to a trek.fm show and select the Briar Patch. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
Well, Patrick, when you're not talking about all the millions of different ways that Ferengi can rip you off, where can our listeners find you on the interwebs?
Well, obviously they can find me here. I also do some guest spots on Warp 5, Earl Grey, The Edge. I try and get around to get my opinions out there. I guess people like to hear them a little bit, maybe, hopefully, and they'll continue to listen here. But you can also find me in the Babel Conference. I'm always there, and I'm also on Twitter at MagicDrop5. One word, the 5 is a number. And Guinevere, when you're not proving that there's no invisible hand with the Ferengis, where can listeners find you?
Well, I don't get around nearly as much as you do around the Trek FM network, unfortunately, so far. but I am very often on the Babel conference. If you check in and make a comment about the show, I'll be sure to be there and respond to it. And just in general on Facebook, just send me a message. I am available occasionally on Twitter, Guinevere42, and just in general, like I say, on Facebook. And if you'd like to help us keep all of our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm. That's patreon.com/trekfm to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It does require a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. And also, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the Briar Patch team from the network, specifically C. Brian Jones, founder and publisher of Trek FM, executive producers Matthew Rushing and Ken Tripp, Aaron Harvey, our art director, Richard Marquez, production manager, and Patreon manager Brandon Shea Mutala. And don't forget to check out Enterprise in Space, a profit of the nonprofit National Space Society. Visit enterpriseinspace.org to find out more and get your seat on the mission. And check out audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for your desktop or mobile device. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm.
Well, we must be heading back into the Briar Patch now. It takes about a day to get to a place where we can transmit. Till next time, this is Guinevere and Patrick, signing out.